My husband spoke in our kitchen, after 2 years of me believing he couldn't hear. Some shocks don't come from strangers. They come from the person you trusted, sacrificed for, and believed you were doing the right thing with. If it were you, when you discovered that everything you built was based on a false truth, would you react immediately, or would you choose to stop? I didn't do what most people expected, and that pause changed my entire life. If you've ever been hurt in a relationship and are still asking yourself whether to hold on or let go, maybe this story will help you see things a little more lightly. I was standing in the kitchen when it all began. That afternoon was completely ordinary. Pale sunlight streamed through the window, falling across the light gray stone countertop. I was chopping vegetables, slowly, carefully, because my belly was already large. 6 months of pregnancy made me tire easily, but it also made me more aware of every movement. I didn't want to rush. I had just finished writing a small note. It was the usual question. Did he want dinner early or late? I still wrote things like that. That was how we communicated. Paper, pen, short, precise lines, nothing out of the ordinary. I heard footsteps behind me. I knew it was Daniel. I didn't turn around. I raised the note to shoulder height out of habit. I assumed he would read it. I thought everything was still the same as every other day. Then I heard his voice. Not loud, not startling, not dramatic. Just a very ordinary sentence, as if it had been held back for far too long. "Helen, I need to tell you something." My hand loosened. The note slipped from my fingers and fell to the kitchen floor. I watched it fall, slowly, as if it had nothing to do with me. I didn't turn around right away. I stood still. Not because I didn't understand what had just happened, but because my body hadn't caught up yet. Daniel continued. His voice was unmistakable, calm, no trembling, no hesitation. He wasn't deaf. He had never been. In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't ask questions. I just felt a hollow open up in my chest, not sharp, not burning, just empty. I turned around very slowly. My belly brushed lightly against the edge of the counter. I had to brace myself with my hands to keep my balance. Daniel stood there, the same familiar face, the same eyes I had been looking into for 2 years. Only one thing was different. For the first time, he stood before me as who he truly was. I wanted to say something, but no words came. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because every sentence felt unnecessary. My body reacted first. My heart raced. My ears rang. I could hear the blood rushing in my head, louder than his voice. The baby inside me moved sharply as if it too sensed the sudden shift. I realized something very clearly, even though I couldn't yet put it into words. When the truth is too large, the mind doesn't fight back right away. It retreats. It goes quiet. It lets the body endure first. Real pain isn't loud. It arrives like this, without warning, without a climax, with just a straightforward sentence on a perfectly ordinary afternoon, in the kitchen I once believed was the safest place in my life. Before I met Daniel, I was 32. At that age, I had a stable job. I worked in urban planning, a field that requires patience and long-term vision. I was used to sitting for hours over drawings, numbers, and extended timelines. I didn't hate my life back then. I didn't consider it a failure either. But I lived alone. My small apartment was on the 3rd floor overlooking a parking lot. In the evenings when I came home, I often turned on the lights very early. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because light made the room feel inhabited. I cooked for one, cleaned up for one, and went to bed in a quiet that stretched on. My mother called regularly. The calls weren't harsh or heavy, but they always circled back to the same thing. Her friend's daughter had gotten married. A distant cousin had just had a baby. Someone she knew wanted to introduce me to a very decent man. She didn't pressure me. She only mentioned it. But when something is discussed long enough, it becomes pressure. Outside the family, things weren't much different. My colleagues started leaving early to pick up their children. Conversations by the coffee machine gradually revolved around schools, family schedules, and vacations with kids. I listened. I wasn't jealous. But sometimes I felt like I was standing on the outside. I didn't think I lacked anything. I was independent, self-supporting, in control of my own life. But on some evenings, after dinner and washing the dishes, I would linger at the sink a little longer, not to think about anything profound, just a very light, steady sense of emptiness, like a space I didn't know how to name. I wasn't sad in the way people usually imagine. I still smiled, worked well, and had friends. But I began to grow used to waiting for a text message, waiting for a call that wasn't about work, waiting for the feeling of someone asking me if I was tired. Looking back, I don't blame myself for that longing. People aren't wrong for wanting connection. Loneliness isn't a flaw, it's simply a state. But prolonged loneliness can soften you. When a hand appears at the right moment, you're more likely to reach for it. Not because you're weak, but because you've grown used to holding yourself up for too long. At the time, I didn't understand this. I only knew that when my mother first mentioned Daniel, I didn't brush it aside as I had before. I paused, and it was that pause, only later did I realize, that was where everything began. I met Daniel on an early autumn evening. We met at a small, quiet restaurant with soft yellow lighting. I arrived a few minutes early and saw that he was already there, sitting upright, both hands neatly resting on the table. When I walked closer, he looked up, his eyes focused on my face in a very particular way. Only later did I learn that this was how he read lips. At the time, all I felt was being truly seen. Daniel didn't speak. He smiled, took a small notebook and a pen from his jacket pocket, wrote a short line and slid it toward me. "Nice to meet you." I smiled back. Our conversation moved more slowly than any date I'd had before. Every question, every answer took time to write out. There was no filler talk, no rush to impress. Strangely, I didn't feel awkward. When I spoke, he watched. When I wrote, he read with complete focus. There was no interruption, no distracted glances. I realized I was talking more than usual, not because I wanted attention, but because I wasn't being pushed to finish. Daniel described his work in short, precise lines. He worked in technology, owned his own company, but never showed off. Everything about him felt measured. I didn't sense judgment in the way he looked at me. He didn't ask my age. He didn't ask why I wasn't married. He didn't ask the questions I had grown used to answering. After our first meeting, we kept meeting. Dinners, slow walks, long stretches of silence that neither of us felt the need to fill. I began learning basic signs, not because he asked me to, but because I wanted to understand him better. When I signed something incorrectly, he patiently corrected me. His hands were gentle, steady. No irritation, no mockery. I felt like I was learning something meaningful. I felt useful. At the time, I didn't realize something significant. I liked feeling needed. I liked knowing I could do something someone else relied on. I didn't recognize it then because it arrived wrapped in a sense of peace. With Daniel, I didn't feel the need to prove myself. I didn't need to be more capable, more independent. I just needed to be there, slowly, clearly. And for someone like me, who had been standing on her own for far too long, that feeling made it very easy to soften. Looking back now, I understand that I fell in love with the sense of safety before I fell in love with the man himself. But at the time, all I knew was that, for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel judged. And for me then, that was enough. We got married the following spring. A small, simple wedding. No noise, no crowd. Everything unfolded gently, just as we had lived together from the start. I remember standing in front of the mirror that day, adjusting my simple dress, thinking that I was finally stepping into a role familiar to so many others. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt settled. After the wedding, we moved into the house Daniel had bought earlier. It was larger than my old apartment. There was a backyard, a separate office for him. I brought my belongings and arranged them neatly in the cabinets. Everything happened naturally, without much discussion. I took that as a sign of harmony. I kept working, but I began coming home earlier. No one asked me to. I didn't need to stay late the way I used to. Daniel worked from home often. I thought he needed me there. Our dinners became more regular. I cooked more, not out of obligation, but because I had the time. Then I became pregnant. The news came to us on a tranquil morning. Daniel smiled and held me longer than usual. I felt myself being placed into a new position, one that mattered. I became more tired, and traveling between projects grew difficult. I asked to reduce my working hours. Later, I stopped working altogether for a while, believing it was only temporary. Daniel's mother began to appear more often. She came by with food and gentle questions. She spoke frequently about rest, about how a woman should conserve her strength during pregnancy. There were no commands, no criticism, just statements that sounded perfectly reasonable. I nodded more than I realized. Some afternoons, I sat in the living room, looking out at the backyard, feeling that I was doing everything right. The right role, the right rhythm. I was a wife. I was about to be a mother. I was at home. I didn't feel as though anything was being taken from me. I only thought that I was setting a few things down, believing I would pick them up later. Looking back now, I understand that no one forced me out of my former life. There was no shouting, no coercion. Everything changed through convenience, through small choices, repeated so often that I no longer remembered when I had made them. At the time, all I knew was that I was doing the right thing, and that feeling kept me from asking questions. After Daniel finished his first sentence, he stopped. He stood in front of me, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, as if he had finally set down a weight he had carried for too long. I didn't respond. I didn't ask him to repeat himself. I just looked at him for a long time, as though I were looking at a stranger with a familiar face. He continued, slowly, without urgency. He said he had never been deaf, that the accident from years ago hadn't happened the way I believed it had, that his silence all this time had been intentional, a choice. I heard each sentence, but it felt as though they didn't enter my mind right away. They passed through me like the sound of rushing water when you stand too close to a waterfall. I understood, but not all at once. He called it a test, a way to know whether the woman beside him had enough patience, enough tolerance, enough attachment to stay when things weren't convenient. He said he had been abandoned before, disappointed before, afraid before, and that he didn't want to relive that. As he said this, I felt a wave of heat rise sharply inside me. Not sadness, not despair. Anger. Apparent, sharp anger. Unmistakable. I noticed my hands trembling, my breathing quickened, my heart pounded so loudly I could hear it. I wanted to say so many things, to ask why me, to shout that he had no right to do this. All of those words appeared at once in my mind, crowding together, demanding release. But I didn't speak. I sat down in the nearest chair, not because I was weak, but because my legs were no longer steady. I placed both hands on my belly, feeling my breath, the small movements inside. And in that moment, I understood something very clearly. If I spoke now, I would say it was out of anger. And if I acted in rage, everything would shatter in ways that could never be repaired. Daniel stayed silent. For the first time, that silence was not a role. It was waiting. I looked down at the floor, where the note from earlier was still lying. A tiny question about dinner. I suddenly found it almost absurd, not in a light-hearted way, but in recognizing the gap between the life I thought I was living and the truth that had just surfaced. I spoke very slowly, one word at a time. I need time. Not to decide whether to forgive, but to keep myself from being swept away. I knew that if I chased right and wrong at that moment, I would lose myself. and I didn't want anything else taken from me that day. Daniel nodded. He didn't apologize right away. He didn't explain further. Perhaps he understood that, at that moment, all words were unnecessary. I sat there a while longer, not calculating, not deciding, just letting the truth rest where it belonged, not denying it, not reacting. Later, when I looked back, I realized that this was the first time in my life I hadn't tried to win a situation. I was trying to keep my mind from becoming unsteady, and it was that pause that stopped me from doing things I would never have been able to undo. I left the house the following morning, not in the middle of the night, not in a rush. I packed a few changes of clothes, essential documents, and the notebook I used for work. I left most of my belongings behind, not because I didn't need them, but because I didn't want my departure to turn into a dispute. Daniel stood at the door. He didn't stop me. He didn't ask where I was going. We looked at each other for a few seconds, long enough to understand that this was not an ending, but it was no longer a continuation as before. I didn't cut things off completely. I made it clear that I needed distance. Distance to breathe, to think, to avoid being pulled into conversations I wasn't ready for. I didn't threaten. I didn't set conditions. I stated what I needed. I went to stay with my sister, Laura. She didn't ask many questions. She prepared a small room for me, placed a glass of water on the table, and said I could stay as long as I wanted. Some evenings we sat together in the kitchen without speaking. She left me alone. That helped me more than anything. In the early days, the anger still came. It arrived in waves, without warning. At times, I felt the urge to call Daniel and finish everything once and for all. At other times, I wanted to turn this story into a clear account of who was right and who was wrong. But every time I stopped myself. I didn't want revenge. Not because I was noble, but because I knew revenge would keep me trapped in the very place that had wounded me. One afternoon, sitting by the window in my sister's house, I said something I had never spoken aloud before. I was blind too. Laura turned to look at me. She didn't argue. She didn't comfort me. She nodded. I didn't say that to blame myself. I told it to face my part honestly. I had liked feeling needed. I had accepted many things without questioning them because I believed that was love. I wasn't wrong for trusting, but I wasn't innocent in letting everything drift so far either. Recognizing that didn't weaken me. On the contrary, it helped me stand more firmly. I no longer needed to prove that I was a perfect victim. I only needed to be honest with myself. During that time, Daniel called. I didn't answer. He sent messages. I read them, but I didn't reply right away. I didn't do this to punish him. I did it to maintain boundaries. I learned something important during that period. Taking responsibility for my inner world doesn't mean taking blame for someone else's actions. It simply means I no longer hand over control of my emotions to anyone else. And that was the first step in not losing my way again. I began therapy not long after leaving the house. Not because I thought I was falling apart. I could still eat, still sleep, still move through my days normally. But I realized that something inside me kept repeating, like an unspoken question. I needed a space to speak, without defending anyone or myself. Dr. Anna Lewis was someone Laura recommended. She was in her early 50s with a steady, unhurried voice. In our very first session, she didn't ask me what I should do next. She said, "Tell the story as I remembered it." So I did, from meeting Daniel, to the notes on paper, to learning sign language, to the early sense of peace, and finally, the moment in the kitchen. I told it without crying, not because I had moved on, but because I was observing it. When I finished, Dr. Lewis was silent for a moment, then said one very short sentence. "What you experienced was a violation of consent." I looked at her. I had heard many words before: deception, manipulation, betrayal, but that one made me stop. She explained without embellishment. that I had entered a relationship based on false information. The choices I made were built on a flawed foundation, and therefore, even though I had acted willingly, that willingness had been distorted from the beginning. I felt lighter, in an extraordinary way, not because someone had taken my side, but because at last, what I felt had a name. In the sessions that followed, we spoke more about me, not about Daniel, not about my mother-in-law, about me. I gradually saw something I hadn't wanted to face before. I was used to standing on my own, taking care of myself, and when I was given a chance to sacrifice, to be needed, I treated it as a value. I didn't think I was trading something away. I thought I was loving. Dr. Lewis didn't judge that. She only said that sacrifice isn't wrong. But if sacrifice is the only way we feel valuable, then sooner or later, we will lose our way. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Understanding this didn't make me blame myself. It helped me see my part in the story more clearly. I wasn't responsible for Daniel's actions. But I was responsible for no longer listening to the small signals inside me. Gradually, the anger stopped coming in waves. It was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I began to distinguish between pain and reaction, and for the first time, I felt no need to rush toward any decision at all. Understanding myself, it turns out, didn't make the pain disappear immediately, but it stopped the pain from leading the way. I returned to that house after nearly 2 months, not because everything was resolved, not because I missed it. I returned because I was calm enough to say what needed to be said and clear-headed enough not to be carried away by emotion. We sat across from each other at the dining table. No notes, no signing, just words, spoken slowly. I spoke first because this was what I needed. I said that I would come home, but not return to the way things were before. I said that anything moving forward would require obvious conditions, not as punishment, but as protection. Transparency came first. No more withheld stories, no more decisions made without my knowledge. I needed to be informed, to be asked, and to have the right to say no. The second condition was no control. No making decisions for me about my work, my relationships, or how I live. I was no longer in a position where I had to prove my worth through sacrifice. The third was no manipulation, no silence as a weapon, no playing the victim, no using the past to force my empathy. If there was a problem, we would speak directly. If we couldn't talk, then we would stop. Daniel listened. He didn't argue. I could see the change in his face, not sudden remorse, but the acceptance of something difficult to swallow. From that point on, he was no longer the one setting the rhythm of this relationship. He lost the initiative he had once taken for granted. Every decision now had to be spoken, considered, and mutually agreed upon. At times, he seemed unsettled. At times, he was silent, but not to avoid, instead to think. I didn't demand grand promises. I didn't need immediate proof. I knew the consequences of what he had done wouldn't disappear simply because I returned. They would remain long-term, and he would have to live with them. For me, this wasn't punishment. It was an order being restored. When boundaries are respected, when the truth is placed where it belongs, justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to stand firm. And for the first time, I stepped into that house without carrying the role of a victim. I carried clarity. My daughter was born on a cloudy morning. The delivery wasn't easy, but there was nothing unusual about it. I was exhausted, in pain, and wholly focused on bringing this child into the world. Daniel was there from beginning to end. He stood beside me, didn't say much, just did exactly what needed to be done. When the nurse placed my baby on my chest, I didn't think about marriage or the future. I only felt that I was looking at a new life, one that had nothing to do with what adults had done wrong. We named her Lily. Daniel was awkward the first time he held her. His hands trembled slightly, as if he were afraid of dropping something more fragile than any project or contract he had ever handled. Watching him then, I realized something. This responsibility was real. There was no room for roles, no room for experiments. The weeks that followed were exhausting. Sleepless nights, diaper changes, feedings, evenings that stretched without clear endings. Daniel was there, not just present, but truly involved. He learned how to be a father slowly without display. I didn't praise him. I didn't supervise. I observed. Even so, I didn't let our daughter become an excuse to overlook everything else. I didn't say things like, for the baby. I didn't use the image of family to cover what remained unresolved. When I needed space, I said so. When I disagreed, I didn't stay silent. Daniel understood that. He didn't ask whether I had forgiven him. He didn't expect a complete return simply because we shared a child. He accepted that becoming a father didn't erase what he had done as a husband. Watching him care for Lily, I didn't see a man redeemed. I saw a man beginning to learn how to take responsibility without expecting a reward. For me, that mattered more than any promise. A child doesn't come into the world to repair adults' mistakes. She comes to live. The rest is still our responsibility. Time passed in a very ordinary way. There was no milestone marking that we had overcome everything. No morning when I woke up and realized I was completely at ease. The early years after Lily's birth were a series of repeating days, caring for a child, doing housework, sleeping too little, and learning how to live with things that were still unfinished. The pain was still there. Some mornings when Daniel sat across from me at the breakfast table, an old image would flash through my mind. That kitchen years ago. The note fell to the floor. In those moments, I didn't push the feeling away. I didn't let it guide me either. I noticed it, then let it pass. We continued therapy for a long time, not to find our way back to what we were, but to learn how to live more honestly in the present. Some sessions were very brief. Some were quieter than words. I didn't force myself to forgive quickly. Daniel didn't push either. After 2 years, I returned to work part-time, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I missed using my mind for the things I was good at. The drawings, the meetings, the long-term plans reminded me of a part of myself I had once set aside. Daniel respected that. He didn't comment. He didn't arrange things for me. Gradually, I realized the pain no longer dictated my decisions. It was still there, like a memory, but it was no longer the center. I didn't use it to define this relationship. I didn't use it to describe myself either. At times, I wondered why everything moved so slowly. Then I understood something. Time doesn't heal on its own. Only when I live consciously through each stage does time have meaning. Healing isn't forgetting. It's the ability to keep living without being pulled backwards by the past every day. And for me, that was already a long way from where I once stood. This year, I am 68. In the mornings, I often sit on the porch after finishing my first cup of tea. The sky here is still frequently cloudy, nothing special. Daniel reads the newspaper. I look at the small garden in front of the house. We don't talk much, but the silence isn't heavy. Everything feels very ordinary. From time to time, old memories still visit. Without warning, an image in the kitchen, a piece of paper, a sentence that changed everything. But those memories no longer unsettle me. They come and go, like gentle gusts of wind. I no longer ask myself the old questions. I no longer ask whether it was worth it. I no longer compare this life with another life I didn't choose. I understand that if I keep asking those questions, I will never fully be present where I am. What I know for sure is that my inner world is no longer ruled by pain. I don't live to prove that I have forgiven. I don't live to repeat what happened. I live with the clarity of someone who has seen enough and no longer needs to defend herself with resentment. Daniel and I don't have a beautiful story in the way people usually tell them, but we share a common truth. We stayed long enough to stop playing roles, to stop experimenting, to stop controlling each other through fear. Some afternoons, my daughter calls. Some evenings, I fold clothes in silence. Tiny things, but I do them with a different state of mind now, unhurried, unburdened. I didn't win against anyone. I didn't lose either. I learned how not to let my own mind defeat itself. And when I am no longer guided by old pain, life, very naturally, becomes calm enough to remain in.